actually making sure everyone understands the context behind things, that decisions are well communicated is really, really, really hard. And I think, way too little thought and design goes into that in most organizations. Any organization of people, it's nearly our superpower, is we can create these complex structures of people that are able to achieve, more than any individual within that group can. Designing your org structure, that's sort of the obvious one, like, how do you group people together? What are the reporting lines and whatnot? But also, what are the processes that kind of animate that structure? How do you communicate to each other? How do you set goals and things like that? You have processes that support your structure. And then I also think there is a really important function in terms of communication, which, again, is another thing that human organizations and software systems have in common, which is actually sharing information and context and data such that everyone can do their job effectively, and sharing that information in a way that is efficient is way, way harder than anybody thinks. And, I think one of these sort of common tropes of people, in more like individual contributor roles is they don't understand why management is doing such a terrible job communicating to them. And it often leads to, I guess, attribution of malice as like, management is keeping us in the dark and whatever. And, I know from being on the other side is that's never true, or very rarely true. These sins are nearly always sins of omission, right? Without what they call the curse of knowledge, which is actually, this sort of cognitive phenomenon, which is when you have a piece of information, or you know something, it's actually very, very difficult to imagine what it's like not to know that piece of information. You can't kind of simulate in your head as like, what would I think if I didn't know this thing? So it causes these empathy failures, and it causes people to simply forget. I think people's brains aren't very naturally wired to keep track of which bits of information have been shared with which people, especially when the number of people starts to grow. Bit of advice, which is to just repeat yourself a lot, is really valuable, because that way, first of all, you cover for the fact that, you may not have told somebody something, so just tell them again. It might be the first time for all you know. And secondly, there's the thing to do with people's memories, right? Which is, just because you've heard something once doesn't mean you remember it. So it comes from both ends, right? The people who are sharing the information aren't sharing it enough, and then the people who are listening to that information are not absorbing it at the same rate that the person sharing the information might expect. Actually making sure everyone understands the context behind things, that decisions are well communicated is really, really, really hard. And I think, way too little thought and design goes into that in most organizations. I think it requires a tremendous act of empathy, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And like I said, it's a difficult thing to do, because you have to put yourself to one side, put what you know, what you feel, what your incentives are to one side, and think to yourself, what is this person's mental state? Because really, if you think about communication in a very fundamental reductionist sense, every act of communication is designed to cause some sort of change in other people's mental framework, whether that's giving them new knowledge or sharing a perspective that you hope they take on board. And if you don't understand their current mental framework, then you're unlikely to be able to make the change that you want. And that's what we call failed communication.